Hello and welcome to my channel. This is my very first video on this channel. I'm constantly listening to true crime vloggers on other channels and telling my husband about the cases that I've heard about, and because he is a defense attorney who deals with crime all day long, he doesn't necessarily want to hear about it from me. And so that is when the idea of this channel was born, because I do think it's important to talk about these crimes and to remember the victims, especially the crimes in which the victims still haven't been found, or when there's a chance that the victims might still be brought home. And in the case I'm going to begin with today, that is exactly the case. This is a case that I haven't seen out there very much in the true crime world, but it was the first story that I thought of when I thought of making my own channel. And that is because it was a case that was close to home when I was a child. Well, when I was a teenager. I was a year younger than one of the victims, and she went missing a town over. It was a town where one of my best friends grew up, and I grew up playing at her house, splashing around in the creek in her backyard. I have a lot of memories in this town. And so when a girl that was 6 months older than us went missing and was never found, when we were all high schoolers, that made a pretty significant impact on our adolescence. This wasn't the sort of area where this sort of thing happened. I grew up in a town with about 2,000 people that was nestled in the mountains of Northern California. This was a town kind of on the other side of the ridge. It was a smaller town. This sort of thing just didn't really happen. Girls didn't disappear while they were walking home from their boyfriends' houses and never come home. So that is the story I'm going to tell you today. But to tell the story of the girl that I'm about to talk about, you have to start with the story of another young woman who is also missing, because the stories of how they went missing are completely intertwined. And so I will begin with the story of Karin Elizabeth Mero, who was last seen by her parents on the night of Valentine's Day, 1997, kicking off a series of events that was going to shatter the peace of a small mountain town forever. Karin Mero lived with her boyfriend and his parents in a now infamous greenhouse on the 300 block of East Minnesota Ave in McCloud, California. McCloud is a logging town in the shadow of Mount Shasta. And as I said, it's quiet, it's small, and it's safe. After seeing her parents on that mid-February day, winter turned into spring, and they still didn't hear from her. Karin's 28th birthday passed. Her parents still couldn't get in contact with her, and that's when they began to really worry that something was going on. You see, Karin had had a liver transplant 4 years earlier. If she didn't take those drugs, she was going to be in major trouble. Bob and Alice Netchell, Karin's parents, were so worried about their daughter that they went down to the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Department and they attempted to make a missing persons report about their daughter. Now, one thing you have to understand is that in these small towns, they are so small that most of them don't have their own police force. In the town that I grew up in, we did not have our own police force after I was in like second grade, and I don't believe McCloud does either. So the sheriff's office, the county sheriff, is who you go to when there's trouble. There's the state police, the highway patrol, and there's the sheriff's office, so that's who you would go to, the county sheriff. However, when they went to the sheriff, they were told that because their daughter had a warrant out for a drug-related offense, she had probably just run away. She was a grown adult and she could go where she wanted. They weren't able to make a report that day. Now, remember, this isn't like it's just been 24 hours or 48 hours. They haven't seen their daughter since February. It is now May 21st when they've gone to the sheriff's office. They haven't heard anything from her for more than 3 months. The Netchells didn't just go to the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Department though. They also contacted the Pacific Medical Center in San Francisco, where Karin had had her liver transplant, but they really weren't getting anywhere as their daughter was an adult. They just weren't getting answers. At this point, this might have been the end of things. No one seemed really all that interested in helping these rightfully concerned parents. But then Hannah Zaccaglini disappeared. This is the disappearance that I remember so clearly from my own adolescence. Hannah was wearing a green and white checkered shirt with daisy buttons, blue jeans, and black canvas Vans when she was walking home from her boyfriend's house that night. Well, actually, he wasn't exactly her boyfriend anymore. From the reports from her teachers, it seems like Hannah had been having a really good day up until she went over to her boyfriend's house. Hannah had a lot going for her. She played the bass guitar in her school's band. They had had a concert the night before, and she had played in that, and they had had an assembly that day at school, and she had played in that too. And they had found out that they were going to be playing at the Wairika Speedway. She was really, really excited about that. Hannah was a cheerleader, she aspired to be a model, and it sounded like she had a lot going on for her. But it also sounded like she had a tough night that night. When she went over to her boyfriend's house that night, he broke up with her. He and his mom were moving to Nevada. And so she left his house holding a handful of pictures of herself that she had given him, and she started the walk home. She lived about a block away, so it wasn't a far walk, and she should have made it home in a few minutes. On her way home, she ran into a family friend who also lived on the same block. Now, when I was researching this case, it was so hard not to just keep imagining what would have happened if she hadn't been walking home at the same moment when he was outside, if she had just not ran into him that night. Because this is where her path becomes so similar to Karin's. On her way home that night, she ran into Ed Henline Sr. Now, Ed Henline Sr. was one of the 3 people that happened to live in that greenhouse that I mentioned earlier. That greenhouse, after Karin went missing, was the home to a husband and wife, Ed Henline Sr. and his wife, Debbie Henline, and their son, who had been the boyfriend of Karin Mero, Ed Henline Jr. Hannah was last seen walking towards her house with Ed Henline Sr., and then she just vanished. And so it was on June 4th, 1997 that Hannah disappeared. Her mom immediately reported her missing when she didn't come home, but as was the case with Karin Mero, the sheriff's department wasn't immediately concerned. After all, she was a teenager. Her parents had divorced the year before, and she had moved up to McCloud from Southern California. She was probably a runaway. It didn't matter that this young girl didn't have the money or resources to just disappear. It didn't matter that she'd left her beloved bass guitar, her purse, her brush, her makeup, all of her belongings, her money, everything at home, all of her clothing, her overnight bag, everything that belonged to her in her room. It didn't matter that she seemed happy in school and that she had a lot to look forward to. She was a teenager who had disappeared. And so runaway it was. And so the case didn't get off to the kind of start that you would hope it would. In the aftermath of her disappearance, the Henlines, who remember were a family friend, stopped by her mom's house and they asked to borrow her car. They had some errands that they needed to do and they needed a van. When they returned the van later that day, after a few hours had gone by, it had been immaculately cleaned. Now, this seemed odd because the Henlines weren't known for being immaculately clean people. They weren't known for being clean people at all. And so this was probably the first of the major red flags, well, maybe the second, and the 2 women had disappeared and they were the last people that had seen them. Another huge red flag that I've heard mentioned is that the Henlines also had a boat in their backyard that they burned in the time following the disappearance of Hannah. Eventually, the Henlines were questioned. During the summer of 1997, the police searched the Henlines' home 4 times, and the Henlines consented to these searches. And then finally, at the end of June, the sheriff's department asked the FBI to get involved, and they did. It was clear that the department had realized that Hannah was more than just a runaway, and that something serious was going on. In October, something happens that is one frustrating point in a string of frustrating moments in this case, and that is that detectives go to the Netchels and they say that they can't get information on whether Karin has received her anti-rejection medications because she hasn't been reported missing yet. October 16th, 5 months after her parents attempted to report her missing the first time. And so her parents are finally able to file a police report, and they do. In November of 1997, the authorities cancel Karin's disability payments and she doesn't come forward. In April, the authorities arrive at the Henline residence with their very first warrant for the case. But this isn't quite the warrant that you might have imagined. Debbie and Ed Sr. are arrested on suspicion of welfare fraud. The detectives believe that they've continued writing checks on her account from the time she disappeared until December 1997. So basically after she stopped receiving those payments in November. And not only that, but they've failed to report that extra income, so they've committed welfare fraud. On April 3rd, the Henlines plead guilty to perjury for fraudulently acquiring the money from Karin Mero's checking account. They are required to pay back $1,898, and they're placed on probation for 3 years. In May of 1998, the Netchells are able to retrieve 2 of Karin's rings that were sold to a jewelry store in Mount Shasta. Mount Shasta is another small town that is near McCloud. Honestly, in towns this small, it just made me wonder that they couldn't get any information from this. How did the jewelry store get the rings? I mean, the Henlines are both very memorable, and in towns this small, it just seems like someone at the jewelry store might have remembered them, especially when this girl went missing. I guess maybe it was because it was a year after, and maybe at that point you would have forgotten who came into the store, but still, I don't know. I guess maybe they don't have records of who they buy the rings from. I'm not sure how jewelry stores work in that regard, but it's unfortunate that that wasn't a lead. And in June, 2 more warrants are served at the Henline residence. This time, 2 cadaver dogs are brought in, and they search the property and then other parts of McCloud for 2 days. In November, a fisherman finds what she believes is hair in McCloud Reservoir. Now, I searched all over, and I feel like this must be a significant amount of hair because people swim in that reservoir all the time. I've gone swimming in it, and so I feel like it must have been a significant amount of hair for her to report it to police, and also for police to react the way they did, because the reaction was to have dive teams from both the Siskiyou County and Shasta County Sheriff's Department coming out, and they searched the reservoir in a grid pattern, but nothing was found. And for a while, the case went cold. And then there was renewed interest when, in May 2004, a tablecloth with red stains on it, along with some clothes, was found partially buried on the outskirts of McCloud. However, when it was tested in a lab, it was found to be free of bodily fluids, so it wasn't human. And it had only been in the ground for 2 years, and at this point, it had been 7 years since the women had disappeared. In 2008, retired detective Rick Schwall was hired to investigate the cold case, and then in 2010, with a new sheriff, John Lopi, in charge, cold case detective John Moser took over where Schwall had left off. Unfortunately, in 2011, Karin's father, Bob Netchell, passed away, never finding out what had happened to his daughter. He had never given up hope that one day her body would be brought home and given a proper burial, since she had long since been declared dead because she could not have survived without her liver medication. On June 13th, 2012, Hannah's case was officially reopened. And then there was an incredibly hopeful moment for the families, because on November 15th, 2012, Ed Henline Sr. was arrested for the first-degree murder of Hannah. 2 days later, his son was arrested in Klamath Falls. He was charged with conspiracy and accessory to commit a crime in connection with Hannah's murder. It finally seemed like Hannah might have justice, like her families finally might get justice. But then in May 2013, the case hit another roadblock. The district attorney looked at all the evidence and pored over it, and he decided that without a body, without knowing how she had died, he could not proceed with the case. He said that he lacked the smoking gun to get a murder conviction. That is where the case stands at this moment. It is believed that there are people in McCloud, in the area, who hold the key to solving this case. That there are people out there who know what happened to Karin and Hannah, who could solve this mystery, who could bring their bodies home so that their families could have a small amount of peace, and so that justice could be served for these 2 young women whose lives were ended far too soon. Honestly, there are coincidences in this world, but the fact that the man who was charged with Hannah's death and later released was known to argue frequently with Karin, and that he was the last person seen with Hannah is too much of a coincidence. The family's actions in the wake of Hannah's disappearance further confirms that something horrible happened that night. I believe that the family took Hannah's mother's van to transport her body somewhere, so that if there was any DNA, it would be in her mother's van, so it would belong there, and then basically detailed it themselves. so that number one, they got credit for a good deed, but then also all the evidence was gone. They cleaned it up, they cleaned it out. Any DNA that was there was supposed to be there. Their DNA was there because they borrowed the car. It made it really not the perfect crime, but it made it very, very difficult for them to be caught. The most frustrating part of this case is that it took so long for law enforcement to react, to believe that these crimes were crimes and that they were more than just these two young women taking off and deciding to leave their families behind. And that if action had been taken immediately, maybe there would have been evidence. Maybe Hannah would still be here. Maybe if someone had taken Karin's parents seriously initially on May 21st when they went to the sheriff's department, if they had even looked into it, maybe the people who committed the crime would have been shooken up enough, and maybe there wouldn't have been a second victim. If you have any information about this crime, please contact the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Department. If you're interested in true crime and missing persons, then hit that subscribe button. And if you have any case suggestions, especially cases that are less popular or that you don't see every day on YouTube, I would love to hear suggestions in the comment section. And I will see you next week. Bye.